if you're not happy now, then you get all those things and you'll still be not happy. And then what is it? You know, and then what do you do? What do you do with yourself after you have everything and you're still not happy? Then what?
Yeah, exactly. And those are the people who come and find me because they're like, on paper, I've hit all the milestones, I got all the stuff and I have everything I'm supposed to have and I've done everything I'm supposed to do. It's like, why am I still unhappy? And I'm like, well, just from like a purely logical basis is that must mean that these things don't actually make you happy. And that's when their world starts to crumble around them. Yeah. And I think it's a balance, right? Because we feel pressure. We don't like feeling the sensation of pressure. And I get it, money is like a real need. Most people are not going to be willing to spend years in debt like I did. I remember the first 2 years after dropping out of law school, I didn't have a job. I was living on my credit cards. I was lucky enough to be with someone at that time who helped support the rent. I was paying rent, but not as much as I could have or should have. So I did come with some privilege. I had some resources available, but it wasn't easy. And I didn't ask my parents for money either. So at the end of the day, it's like you have to weigh your options, but it's always that balance, right? Like here's the short-term need versus the long-term need. And unfortunately, I don't think our culture supports people through thinking and clarifying for the long term. So people always default to the short term, which I'm sure you've seen.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for joining today for another episode of Define Your Purpose, the birthplace of ideas. And joining me today is the executive leadership coach from Seattle, Washington, Jule Kim. Jule, thanks for taking the time. Really appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Carl. It's an exciting time. Thank you for inviting me on your podcast.
Yeah, for sure. I was really impressed by your background, and all the different things that you've had for experience, and such a roundabout way to get to the coaching realm. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you a little bit about your path and how you got started there.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, I do think that my trajectory, like the path I've taken to get to becoming a coach, is probably fairly unusual. And not unusual in terms of having taken different choices or changing careers. It's
Mm,
more probably along the lines of how many times I've changed careers.
mm,
So I think one of the biggest issues we have today, like on a wider scale, and hopefully I don't cause any hate in the audience here, but I think going to college when you're 18 or 19 and having to pick something to study is really risky. Like it's such a gamble. Like you have no idea at that point like what it is you really want to do.
mm.
And so if you think about it, like you go into college feeling this pressure like you have to choose something because you're spending so much money. And
Yeah.
if you compare college to like a business investment you would normally take, there's something strange going on there because I honestly feel like if you were to think of it as a business decision, do I want this program? Do I want to go into this particular field or niche? You would probably spend some serious time thinking about it. But when it comes to college, everybody just goes to college. They go to university because that just tends to be what a lot of people do. And so you put yourself into this track and you feel pressured to complete the track and on time or to do something. And so the focus comes away from actually thinking about what it is you want and who you are, which I think is actually a hard question to answer at that age. And the focus then becomes on, I need to get a degree so I can get a job. And I'm like, what's the point of having a degree in something you don't really know if you want? And that's what happened to
Mhm.
me. So I graduated with a math degree from Berkeley. I
Mhm.
went on to law school, and it was the same kind of decision making again. I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do after college. So I don't want to go teach math, which is what most of my friends were doing. And I was like, okay, some of my friends are going on to grad school. Let me do that, but I don't want math. So let
Mhm.
me do law school. And so then I go to law school. I drop out in my second year. But in that time, I started doing something that I'd always wanted to do, which is a lot of writing. So I had a fairly popular blog back then. And we're talking like this is 2004. So kind of early on in the internet marketing scene, with you and I both having this kind of background. I dropped out of law school, but because I had a blog with so much writing on it, that's how I got my first job as a writer. So I
Mhm.
then spent the next 10-ish years with being a writer and editor. I eventually realized, you know what, I don't really like this kind of writing very much. So I eventually land at Amazon. I did technical writing, I did product management, and then at that point, I left the corporate world. So I started a photography business and spent, I think, 4 or 5 years there, and then, pandemic hit. So I think the pandemic is really, really interesting, at least in my journey, and I feel like it's played a part in a lot of people's journeys too, because it was a forced pause. It was such a huge
Mhm.
disruption to our way of life,
Mhm.
and it, like, shook us out of our habits, right? So just falling into the daily grind, feeling like there are bills to pay, here's the routine, gotta support the family, the kids, all of it. You gotta go to work, gotta deal with the commute, and, like, we forget, again, like, we fall into this habit of trying to complete a track instead of stepping back and thinking, "What do I want?" And that's a really hard question for people to answer. So, I spent, I think, quite a while feeling shame about having changed directions so many times. I was even a gamer at one point, not professionally, but, just for fun. And I've sold MLMs. I was a content manager. I've done SEO. So, like, so many different paths. And at the end of the day, it's like you'll see somebody who does this because they're still searching, and then there's another group of people where they don't search because they've given up and they're like, oh, I guess this is how things are supposed to be. But then they go through life with that dissatisfaction and that discontent just
Mhm.
growing. Like it just keeps growing. And they're like, I'm not happy, but I should be. Like
Mhm.
I should be grateful compared to so many other people who don't have these things, who don't have a good job and a nice house and a nice car and a beautiful family. And it goes deeper than that. Those are all external metrics of success. So I
Mhm.
think a lot of it is just me coming back to this question of what do I want and how do I see success? And
Mhm.
then a
Right.
huge part, which I think is challenging for people, is withstanding the pressure from my community. So the
Mhm.
friends I had, my family, especially my parents, it's been challenging. But yeah,
Mhm.
it's been a journey.
Yeah. Well, I guess from like you said, from the college debt on, you have the expectation then to earn money to pay back, and there's kind of always that pressure, I guess, right? And that makes you have to figure it out or have to do something anyway. Um,
Yeah. And I think it's a balance, right? Because we feel pressure. We don't like feeling the sensation of pressure.
mhm, mhm,
And I get it, money is like a real need. Most people are
mhm,
not going to
mhm,
be willing to spend years in debt like I did. I remember the first 2 years after dropping out of law school, I didn't have a job. I was living on my credit cards.
mhm,
I was lucky enough to be with someone at that time who helped support the rent. I was paying rent, but not as much as I could have or should have. So I did come with some privilege. I had some resources available, but it wasn't easy. And I didn't ask my parents for money either. So
Mhm.
at the end of the day, it's like you have to weigh your options, but it's always that balance, right? Like here's the short-term need versus the long-term need. And unfortunately, I don't think our culture supports people through thinking and clarifying for the long term. So people always default to the short term, which I'm sure you've seen.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and then they feel like they're stuck on the hamster wheel. Eh, But the average graduate now switches careers 7 times. I mean, switches um, jobs 7 times in their career. Um, so and probably a number of those times are switching career type moves. So it's more. I think it's more the norm now to have this kind of disruption and this not really being sure for so much of the time about a lot of things in your life.
Oh,
Uh,
for sure. Do you work with a lot of younger people, like Gen Z at all?
I have, yeah,
Have you
yeah,
noticed this? Every time I work with someone who's in high school or, college or has just graduated college, like around that time frame, so they can be anywhere from 17 to 24.
mhm,
And I've noticed there's like this wave of depression hitting this generation.
mm,
And a lot of it seems to stem from this expectation that they should know their one thing and they should know right now.
mm,
Whereas I'm of the mindset, not in a
mm,
condescending manner at all, but just from like a purely factual basis, is like if you're 20, like you've barely experienced life outside of your family unit.
mhm,
You have probably seen very little of the outside world outside of your
right,
town.
right,
And at that point, what experiences have you had in order to help you determine what you want to do? What is that one thing? So
mhm,
there's the expectation that they should know that right now and that there should only be one thing. So, you know how I mentioned the shame is like, I have had so many comments from people I know
mm,
saying, "Have you found your one thing yet? Is this finally it?" As
mm,
if I've been failing all along. It's like, wow, thanks.
right, right. Or as if there was something wrong, right, wrong with that. I mean, it, we have this kind of also thing in our culture about being an A, always being the A student and doing what you're good at, and this perfectionist thing. I think that really, in the end, just ends up hurting most people, and it really causes people to shut down and not be able to do anything. And I think it's taught we're taught that mainstream as if that was like the best practice or something.
Oh my gosh, you're so
To be the
right.
perfect student.
Yeah, and also in other areas of life too, right? Like the perfect business owner, the
Mhm,
perfect spouse, the perfect partner,
mhm, mhm.
the
Yeah,
perfect parent.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's overwhelming.
yeah, yeah, yeah. To think that you should have never done anything to fail when it's really like the opposite is true. That to be a good any of those things, you have to try all the ways that don't work to learn the ways that actually do work for you. I think.
Yeah. It's a hard I think it's a hard process for people to go through though because there's so much self-judgment
Mhm.
all along the way.
Yeah.
So I think intellectually, most people will understand what you just said, like on a rational intellectual level. But when it comes to actually doing that in your life, that's when everything starts to go off the rails.
Mhm.
And
Right.
I find with the
Right.
clients I work with, I'm sure with your clients, you see this too. Is like, how many people do we encounter where they come to us and they want us essentially to help them convince themselves to keep staying in a job they don't want. And
Mhm.
and they'll make it about these other things like, "Oh, I need health insurance or I need to support my family." I'm like, "No doubt."
Right.
But what has you thinking this is the only way to do that?
Right, right. Or I have to get the promotion and be a manager, and then if I'm a manager, I'll get more pay, and then I'll be in charge, and everything will be good.
Yeah, it's the "and
It's
then
that
I'll be
crazy,
happy"
crazy
mentality.
thinking. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then, right, and then I'll be happy one day.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's so important to make up your mind to be happy now, whatever you're doing, because it's probably not going to come to you one day if it's not coming to you now.
Well, in your experience, like, why is it that people think this? Like, happiness one day, right? I'll be
Mhm,
happy
mhm.
later. If I
Yeah,
have this, then I'll finally be happy.
yeah. Well, they kind of, I think people get sucked into this preparing for. They get set up with this. One day I'll have what I want, and it kind of it's like this carrot that they go after the whole time. That one day when they get the retirement package, and one day they get the boat, and one day they get the whatever they're imagining, then they'll be happy. And it's like, even if they had all those things, they all come with a price. So if you're not happy now, then you get all those things and you'll still be not happy. And then what is it? you know and then what do you do?
Yeah,
What do you do with
exactly.
yourself after you have everything and you're still not happy? Then what?
Yeah, exactly. And those are the people who come and find me
Right.
because they're like, on
Mhm.
paper, I've hit all the milestones. I got all the stuff and I have everything I'm supposed to have and I've done everything I'm supposed to do. It's like,
Mhm.
why am I still unhappy? And I'm like, well, just from like a purely logical basis, is that must mean that these things don't actually make you happy. And
Mhm.
that's when their world starts to
Right.
crumble around them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We end up doing things for other people's reasons instead of our own. And that ends up being a big problem too, I think.
Oh, 100%. Oh my gosh. Like I wish I had my affirmation card right here. I don't know if you know this, but I published a set of affirmation cards last year
Oh, neat.
and they came out at the end of Halloween. But like
Okay.
literally the one card that has been sitting on my desk is sitting in my bedroom right now because I took a picture of it to show my client and the affirmation is I live free from outside expectations.
Mm,
And it's
right.
such a hard thing, like especially if the expectations are from our family or
Mhm.
culture. Both of those things I find to be the hardest to have people really examine when they work with me.
Right. Right. Yeah. Sometimes it's the people with the good intentions that have, they have good opinions and they want to help you. Sometimes those are the most toxic because they end up being the ones that you listen to the most closely. And if it happens to be advice that just keeps you where you are and keeps you doing whatever makes them happy, then it's not really you growing.
Yeah, and that's a huge one, especially for a significant set of the people that I work with. So I don't know about you. I would assume that the makeup of your clients demographically are maybe a little bit different, like compared to me. And here's what I mean.
Okay.
So I would say more than half of my clients tend to be women of color.
Mm,
They share the immigrant experience like what I have. And so they're
interesting.
seeking someone who understands their background, which, as you know, with your marketing background, just like me, is like that's actually a pretty important factor.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I have noticed that with people who come from this sort of immigrant context, is that our parents, like the struggle or the challenge here is that we know that our parents usually have our best interests at heart, which is number one, their opinions are going to hold more weight and influence over us. But then number two, what we don't understand is usually happening here when you see the parents pushing for a traditional job, such as a lawyer, a doctor, a computer science like engineer,
Mhm.
it's because they're safety oriented.
Yeah.
And that's going to come very heavily emphasized, especially in the immigrant culture, because safety is so lacking. These
Yeah.
are people who have uprooted their entire lives and their families to come to a different country. And
Mhm.
so safety is a huge factor.
Right.
And I don't think that most of the parents in that generation understand how safety is driving all of their conversations with their children.
Mm.
And so at the end of the day, it's like if you look at that, the parents are subconsciously thinking, I need to know my children will be okay after I'm gone. And
Mhm.
here's my way of ensuring that. They should have a certain type of career, they should marry a certain type of person, and they should live in a certain type of place, and they should have certain standing in the community or the culture.
Mhm. Mhm.
And these are expectations, and they can be so
Mhm.
heavy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it's all like, what's the top earner list in Newsweek? You know, what are the top schools? What are the top careers? What are and it gets exhausting because it has nothing to do with who you are or who you were born to be. You know, you weren't born to be one of the top 10 of every list.
Yeah, it's a oh my gosh, you're giving me flashbacks to one of my client sessions from I can't remember like the end of last year. So you
Yeah.
notice how the end of the year, like the turn of the year tends to trigger a lot of like anxiety in people
Mm,
because
right.
what are they doing? They're looking back over the year and asking themselves, what have I really accomplished?
Mhm.
And so those like 30 under 30 or 40 under 40 lists, just like what you're saying, like the top
Yeah.
earner lists or the top
Mhm.
anything lists,
Mhm.
and people start flipping out. It's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. That's true. It is kinda around this time of year too. That's funny. Maybe it has to do with, like, budget season or something.
Yeah, a lot of it, there's like stuff with budgets at work or where are we going to allocate our budgets for next year for developing our people, but then
Mm,
also our own budgets like personally, what have I done to invest in myself if I even believe that's a thing.
mm.
So that's the other piece that I find is like a huge challenge. I don't know if your practice, your clients, do they tend to be more women versus men, or have you noticed any trends?
Um, maybe a few more men, um, yes,
Okay.
overall, I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah. It's it's very what was I going to say? I think I lost my train of thought. Oh my gosh. Sorry.
that's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. As
It,
far as clientele
oh,
and
oh, I remember. Yeah. It was the fact of investing in yourself. And
mm,
I've recently realized, which really shouldn't be a surprise, is women especially have a hard time believing that they deserve to invest in themselves. And I
mm,
find that mothers find it even more challenging.
mm,
So, mothers, I'm sure you've seen this all over the place where they feel they should always put the family first, the children first. And at the end of the day, it's like, where are they on the list? And sometimes you'll find that they're not even on the list, period.
yeah,
Everyone else is on the list. They didn't even make the list, not even at the very bottom.
right, right.
It's,
Or it's get your hairs or your nails done, I guess, would be the societal thing, right?
yeah.
That's your me time.
Yeah. And I find that with some of my clients, that mentality or that mindset is so pervasive that one of my clients, she said that she never even eats out. She never goes to McDonald's or any restaurant, period. Because she's always so conscious. It's like, I don't deserve to spend this money on me. And I was like,
Uh,
what? That is wild to me. And her thinking was, no, we have food at home and I should
mhm.
use our money wisely. And that means not eating out. And to her, that
Yeah,
meant putting the family first. I was like,
right.
if you look at that, that is so, like, that was really hard for me to hear,
Mhm. Yeah.
not passing judgment
People
on that.
people can, do the same fall into the same trap with exercise, I think, too, thinking that they shouldn't be spending that time on themselves, and they should be spending that time with their family instead, and they're just being selfish if they're exercising, and that's just crazy because you are not gonna be able to be there for the people you care about if you don't take care of yourself. You have to take care of yourself first.
Yeah, that is exactly it. I find that so many of these people, especially the women, there's this undercurrent of feeling like they're being selfish if they do anything for themselves, just
Right?
like you said, the exercise. And if it's not being selfish in regards like relative to their family, then the other major piece of guilt they're carrying is I should be working either in the job or the business, right? Like all these
Mm,
shoulds, like I should be doing these other things because they're more
mhm.
important than me. And
Yeah.
so, this question I asked one of my clients recently, I think it was around 2 or 3 weeks ago, I asked her, do you feel that you deserve to put yourself first? She didn't answer the question.
Mm,
And then she comes back to me the week after and she said, that question you asked me was really provoking.
right. Mm,
And she'd never thought about it.
wow, great. That's awesome. Sounds like you really helped her. That's great.
I mean, we'll see, it's like helping. I'm not responsible for their results, but at the end of the day, it's like
Mhm,
there comes a point where you learn and you shift your perspective, but what does that mean for the action you take? What
mhm, right,
decisions will you make differently or the choices you choose differently?
mhm,
What does this mean? Because at the end of the day, it's like if you keep doing the same things, then you're going to keep ending up with the same things.
mhm. Totally. Yeah. I think the whole purpose of knowledge is action because if I mean, you can just be your own librarian and never go anywhere, I guess.
Oh my gosh, that's me. I'm guilty of that right there. So long.
Right?
And yeah. Do you deal with a lot of people who feel imposter syndrome?
Um, yeah, I think that, um, almost everybody feels it at one point or another, um, but probably most when people are trying to do something that they haven't always done, I guess.
Mhm.
Is that kind of what you found?
Yes, and so that's where the knowledge, like what you just said about being the librarian, like it really plays in. So that tends to be
Mhm.
like a major sign that you might be experiencing imposter syndrome, and that
Right?
was me. It's like when I left to start
Mm,
my photography business, I think I spent like 2 years making no money, and I was
mm,
like in this constant cycle of taking classes and going to workshops and
yeah.
trainings and feeling like, "Oh, I didn't know enough."
Mhm.
Yeah, and that tends to be the other major common thread with women of color or just people of color in general,
Mhm.
especially immigrants.
Right. So, what do you find that works the best when you're feeling that yourself, or how have you helped your clients to get through that?
It depends on the person, which I know you're familiar with. It's not like a one approach fits everybody, but I think in general, having them even identify or like see just how strange their actions are relative to what they say they want. So finding those discrepancies, that's like the first
Mhm.
thing.
Yeah.
And people are generally just super rationalizers. You know, if you question them on anything, they're like really good at giving you a reason. Well, here's why. And I'm like, that reason doesn't actually make sense, but you think it does. So that's the first step. And the second step is generally to sort of look into their history a little bit. So there tends to be some common causes, or let's say common background factors that will trigger imposter syndrome. So, like
Mhm.
me, growing up in an immigrant family, I mean, I grew up in Alabama. Okay, I'm Korean. I'm not white or black.
Right. It
So,
sounds
to,
difficult.
yeah, it was really difficult, and I didn't even know just how much that impacted how I felt like I had to show up.
Mm,
So that's one of the most obvious indicators is when you are a person as a part of a group where you feel like you don't belong. And so when you are different in any way, whether that's your background, your culture, your skin color, your economic status, it can be anything, your sexual orientation. When
mhm,
you're the one who's different and you start feeling like you don't belong, that tends to trigger imposter syndrome.
mm,
And there are many other factors like that as well.
mhm,
Um, Cultural is like the whole culture thing is a huge factor in general because when you come from many other cultures, we often have this idea of you have to be humble,
mm,
especially in the Asian culture. But then what that causes is generally a history of downplaying and dismissing all of your own successes. And that's one of like the major elements of imposter syndrome. So if you don't know imposter syndrome, it's that feeling that you're about to be discovered as a fraud. And it's because you have a history of downplaying or dismissing your successes. We call it like this compulsive dismissal. And yeah, so it's very it's interesting. And I'll just add this part. And you do this despite having all the proof and all the evidence. Like you have a track record of actually being good at what you do. So you're not actually an imposter, but you feel like one.
right. Yeah, yeah, those are I mean, that's a good way to define it. I I think another thing that maybe works for people is when they think about something in their life that they've really excelled at and been really good at, and when they start thinking about the thought patterns that they've applied to that, then if they apply it to the new thing that they're trying to do, then frequently that can help people to figure out kind of that perspective of what it's like to just be good at it and have done it for a while.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. That's one of the, I guess, tools that I sometimes will use with my clients, you know, this question of, okay, so what was it about you in that prior experience
Mhm,
that was really challenging, but you somehow overcame it or you turned that into a success?
mhm,
Now, what's really interesting with people who are experiencing imposter syndrome is they can't even get there because they're so busy dismissing it. You know, so
mm,
let's say I asked you the last time like you did this project. I was like, "What was it about you?" And then a person with, like, really strong imposter syndrome tendencies will be like, "Oh, no, it was because I had help."
mm,
So they can't even get to,
mm,
like, recognition of what they brought to the table because they're so busy attributing all the stuff to other people or other circumstances. Like, you'll hear this one a lot too, "Oh, I got lucky." And it's in super ridiculous circumstances. Like, I had a friend, she she doesn't work. And for the longest time, I was like, "How does she live if she doesn't work? Like, what is she? Like, independently wealthy? Like, what is this?" And then one day I find out it's because she has real estate investments. And I was like, "Oh, that's so cool." And then she goes, "Oh, no, I got lucky." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And it turns out she spent over a year studying the market around where she lived. She spent 10 years saving up the money, right? The capital in order to be able to invest when the timing was right. And yet in her mind, she got lucky. And
mm,
I was like, "So you spent 10 years saving up all this money. You spent another year studying all the locations all around your state, And you think you got lucky? Really?
Right? That's funny. And I think people have this tendency to just when they discredit themselves, or when they talk bad about themselves. There's kind of this little part of you that's listening. This little, your little the warrior you is inside, and can get, I think, can get hurt by by the things that you say about yourself in that way. I think it's important to be really careful about things like that.
Oh, 100%. The words, because I think we've all heard, or maybe most of us have heard the phrase like your words shape your reality, right? Or your words create
Mm,
your reality. And I can't tell you how many people, like most of the people I know in my life, they dismiss that notion. They're,
mhm,
they'll
really,
say, like, yeah, yeah, but in their head, they're like, whatever, you know?
mhm.
And I have found this really fascinating research. Have you ever watched Atlas of the Heart on HBO with Brene
No,
Brown?
mm-mm.
Okay.
It's a good
In
one?
the second episode, you should watch it. I feel like
Yeah,
everyone should watch it because the
okay,
entire
yeah,
show is her showing you what emotions mean and how they function, how they
mm,
feel. I was like, "Oh
mm,
my gosh, this is like this should be education in like every middle school, basically,
mm,
is what I feel. And maybe like a child version of that in elementary school even." But in the second episode, there was something so cool she shows. She highlighted this research from this other woman. I think her name is Kristen Lindquist. She's an emotions researcher. And she did a paper that shows something so interesting that emotions have recipes. Okay.
mm,
So
okay,
when something happens and you feel the first onset of the emotion, you can think of it like a block of Play Doh landing on your plate, like right in front of you,
mm,
and it has no shape. Okay. So you feel something, usually in your body somewhere. And then what's really important is how you describe that experience, the words you use to call that feeling is ultimately what really shapes your experience after.
mm,
So, how you're shaping that Play Doh is determined by the words you're using. So you can make something that looks like roadkill, or you can make something functional, something useful out of it. And it really hinges on how you're describing it with what kind of language, what kind of adjectives. Are you being super judgmental? And so, a very common thing I've seen is I think the example she gave of herself, Brene Brown, she was like, I tend to go around saying, I'm overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed like all the time. And so, what we don't understand is that when you use the wrong words or descriptors so casually, what you do is you end up shifting the emotion. So, maybe that block of Play Doh didn't start off this way, but because you keep labeling it that way, it becomes this other thing. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is mind blowing to me.
awesome. Yeah, yeah, that is a really good description. I think your feelings are also messages from your that part of you that has no language. The part of you that is there before birth, before you learn to talk and all. You're just, this blob of feeling, basically. And that part of you, I, there's a barrier, I think, between that and language, that kind of like the different parts of the brain. um, I,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. So that's another part that I learned in the last couple of years, like what you're describing, is I did not know this, but it suddenly makes so much sense. And I remember back in the day, I forget, like I was driving on the freeway with my ex, and whatever I was perceiving at that time, there was a person who was driving in our lane, like like in the next lane next to us. And she had started merging over, unaware that we were right there.
Mhm.
And so emotionally, I reacted And it was so instantaneous, I didn't even know. And the cascade of events was, I thought, someone is screaming. Who's screaming? I was the one screaming. So I was already reacting to this danger that my rational brain hadn't caught up to yet, which is where language is. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And so then years later, that was, gosh, that was probably like 15 years ago or something.
Mm,
And it was only in like 2 years ago that I learned that every time you perceive something, it's like data coming at your brain and then it hits a fork in the road and it splits. And so one fork is a lot shorter. That shorter fork is to your emotions. The longer road, the other fork in the road, is to your rational reasoning side of the brain with language. And so the data goes in both paths, but one of them hits a lot faster. And I was like, oh, I see. And so going back to that emotions researcher, she was saying how this is why animals and babies experience emotions differently. Like it's a lot more vague and unformed. And so the experience of it is just completely different from what you experience once you start to develop in your brain. It's like, wow.
mm. That makes sense. Very interesting. It's good stuff to talk about. So, I wonder, what are some other maybe strategies that you use with your clients? Are there other common problems maybe that you addressed in your coaching? You were mentioning they had some similarities.
I think beyond imposter syndrome, the other two major areas that I tend to end up working with my clients, one in the workplace, just presenting themselves with confidence, which, very
Mm,
heavily related to imposter syndrome,
mhm,
but understanding how to read people, which of course means understanding to like how to read themselves, even like understanding what they're seeing, how they're feeling, how they're thinking, and being able to identify that. So that's a really
mm,
huge step for most of my clients.
mm,
And the reason why I focus on that is because we have so many expectations and judgments bundled into our life, like every single day, almost every moment. And when you get to this phase of you're unhappy, is because that kind of stuff is overtaking every other part of your life now. What used to maybe be like 10% or 20% of the time has reached like 70 or 80% of the time.
mm,
And usually it's those expectations and judgments directed at yourself. So, all of those things we mentioned earlier, like I should be better than this, I
mhm,
should be a better mother, I should be making more money, those kind of things. So, that's one part is to unpack what you're feeling, which then helps you understand other people better. And
mhm,
then the other piece of that is just having people skills, right? Relationship skills. If
mhm,
this person is acting or saying certain things in a certain way, what does that mean? So it's kind of the same exercise, but with other people. So now expand it outside of yourself of what am I thinking and feeling? What is that person thinking and feeling?
mhm,
And then just a very broad level of what's the appropriate response for both. So if I'm thinking and feeling this way and I don't like it, what could I do to make myself feel better? And then for the other person, if that person is acting and feeling, a certain way, then what would be the best thing I could do for that person? And I don't mean that in a
mhm,
means of I'm taking responsibility for how they feel, but it's like, what would be best for that person? If I know that person tends to need some time to themselves to cool off, then the appropriate response would be for me to check in with them and then to leave so they can have their space. If that person is the opposite, there are some people where they would see that as a sign of abandonment. It's like, okay, to check in and just keep that relationship, the communication lines open. Yeah, so those would be some of the major things, and then, there's, like, a whole other list, like setting boundaries, like identifying people-pleasing behavior. Those are really common. What about you? Like, what do you see in your clients?
Mhm. Yeah, I think people, don't set any goals. Most most adults won't have any goals at all. They'll just be thinking that they kind of work on their career when they have to, and I think that's really terrible, and it's kinda like you wouldn't get in the car and just start driving and expect to get where you wanted to go, obviously, but that's basically what you're doing when you have no picture in your mind of where you're trying to get to, then you're never gonna get there. You're just gonna keep spinning your wheels, I think. So, um, having different kinds of goals too is really important, and making sure that they're your goals and not someone else's. A lot of people struggle with that as well.
What do you mean by different kind of goals?
Um, as far as short term and long term, and what you want to have happen next month or 6 months from now, a year, 5 years. If you're not picturing these things, then there's no way for your subconscious to be putting any of the pieces in place. So it's just slowing yourself down by not knowing what to do more of the time, by not being clear. It's almost telling yourself as much as it is declaring it, the importance is of talking about it. It's really, it's just for you. It's not for the coach or for the professor or for the parent or for the spouse. It's not what do you want to have happen for everybody else. It's an exercise for you.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think people should take more time to do that regularly, and maybe on a cycle during the year or something like that. I mean, I think you mentioned the power of writing and journaling for yourself, and maybe that's tied in with that for a lot of people.
Okay, so in your opinion, what's the ideal cadence, or how frequently should people be checking in on their goals or identifying them even?
Um, I would say at least quarterly, um, every few months, probably, if not more. I mean, it's better if you can think about things every day. If you can spend time every day visualizing how you want things to be. If it's really important to you, then thinking about it shouldn't be any kind of a chore or thing you need to schedule.
I think there are certain challenges to some of the goal setting because I've tried some of those goal setting planners like
Mm,
many, many times.
right? Mm,
And I don't think this is just me, but like as I was listening to you saying, think what you want 6 months out or a year out, 5 years out. I think my biggest challenge has always been like, I don't know what I want 6 months from
mhm,
now. And this is me several
mhm,
years
mhm.
ago. That's not me anymore. Like, I actually
Okay,
do have a much better idea,
great.
but
Okay.
it took me a long time to be able to answer those questions. Like, what do
Yeah,
you think keeps people unable to answer those questions?
um, a matter of alignment and understanding of yourself. So I think you have to spend enough time thinking about what's important to you and what you like. You know, what do you actually enjoy, and start from there, because everybody does know that. Everybody does know what's fun, and what they enjoy more in life and what they enjoy less. So, you can to some extent you can start shaping an idea of how you want to spend your days around that. You're starting over, I guess, from scratch. What you want to do.
I think that's actually a hard question because, like,
Mm,
I'm reflecting on my experience in 2020. And I remember one of my peer coaches, I went through a coach training program. And she asked me, like, what do I find fun? Like, essentially, what's fun? And I remember blanking out.
mm,
Like, that was actually a really hard question for me. And, maybe it's the type of people I attract to myself, like the people who want to work with me. But, like, the whole idea of, like, what do I want tends to be the hardest question for them
mm.
to answer. They
Yeah.
can tell you what they don't want. So
Mhm,
it's
mm,
actually really funny because it's like
yeah,
if I ask them what do you want, they'll actually answer like 5 different ways what they don't want. And I'm like, okay, that's great. Like that kind of helps us narrow it down, but it still doesn't tell us what do you want.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Or things like, I mean, like, reading might not be fun, but you might think that the benefits of reading are good to have, so maybe it should be something that you should do anyway. So where does that fall in, right?
Or find a different channel where you can get that reading delivered to you, audiobooks.
Yeah.
Well, we have different learning styles,
Mhm,
and
mm, mm,
it's so funny. I remember seeing a thread out there, and there's probably multiple threads, but I was just like, seriously, you guys don't have anything better to do with your time. The threads debating whether audiobooks are reading. And I'm like, please, why are we wasting any time on this? And so I've even seen in some of my clients, they feel ashamed to listen to the book, so they try to force themselves to, like, read the book, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, like, just take it in whichever way that works for you."
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, all you're doing is creating someone's voice in your head, so however you're hearing that voice, it's just the ideas that you're getting from hearing the narrative, really, if you think about it.
Yeah, so that's my one question I like to ask my clients, will come up periodically, is like, "What has you doing that?" Right? So in this instance, like, what has you listening to what other people think about what reading is?
Right. Yeah, yeah, totally. So, where can people find you if they wanna have a great conversation with you? And, um, what's it like once they get in touch with you?
Well, they can reach out to me on LinkedIn, which is how you and I connected, or they can find me on my website, adviceactually.com. So
Okay,
look me up on LinkedIn, Jule Kim, Jule Kim, and you'll find me there. I like to be honest, I'm on all the socials, but I'm most likely to respond to a LinkedIn message or a message from my website.
okay, okay, perfect. Great. Well, it's been really good talking with you today. I really enjoyed our conversation. We should maybe catch up sometime and have another talk.
I would love that, Karl. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, yeah, you're very welcome. Um, and y I do like to say that when you, walk with purpose, you collide with destiny.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So that's what I like to say at the end of the show. So, really want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with me. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend. Take
Okay.